pair of serial killers roamed the Midwest, preying on adults and children alike. Always a step behind, agents had no choice but to follow the trail of bodies. As the crime spree raged out of control, pressure mounted to stop these killers.
They swept through 6 states like a plague, thrill killers acting without rhyme or reason. They targeted adults and young girls, kidnapping, murdering, then moving on to kill again. And in their rampage, they left plenty of clues. But moving targets are the hardest to hit. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. The hunt was on for these killers with a knack for eluding authorities. We hoped a nationwide dragnet would bring them to justice.
In Kenosha, Wisconsin, a community close to the Illinois border, single mother Juanita Wheat arrived home with her 9-year-old daughter Vernita and their new friend Robert Knight. It was getting late on the evening of May 29, 1984, when they returned from a day of fun at a local carnival. Robert told Juanita that he had a belated Mother's Day present for her at his place just a few blocks away. He asked if Vernita could help him carry it back. He promised it would only take an hour. Reluctant at first, Juanita gave in to her daughter's excited pleas.
All right. Be goodbye, baby. We'll be right back. Take care, mommy. I will.
As it approached midnight, Robert and Vernita had not yet returned. Juanita was anxious about leaving her apartment to look for her daughter. If Vernita arrived to an empty home, the young girl might panic. But the worry became too great. Juanita decided to go and find her daughter. She went to the address Robert had given her. When she arrived, her panic melted into horror. The building that Robert Knight claimed was his home was abandoned.
I thought she'd be back in 15 minutes.
Not knowing where else to turn, Juanita went to her friend Ellen Reeves for help.
You know where she's at? No, I'm looking for.
Concerned for the safety of her friend's daughter, Ellen insisted it was time to contact the police. Juanita told the officer that her happy, outgoing daughter would not have run away. The officer's focus turned to Robert Knight. Juanita said she had met Robert a month earlier. He introduced himself while riding through the neighborhood on his bike. They had become friendly, and Robert had become fond of young Vernita. The police didn't have a Robert Knight on record. The officer asked Juanita to check mugshots for anyone who might look like him. Juanita scanned 2 books of photos. Finally, she pointed to a picture of a man she was sure was Robert Knight. Officers determined that the person Juanita had identified as Robert Knight was really named Alton Coleman. Investigators called the FBI. Special Agent Verdina Passanelli of the FBI's Kenosha, Wisconsin office was assigned the investigation.
But the FBI always gets involved when children of tender years disappear under unusual circumstances, and this was clearly one of those.
Investigators wasted no time in obtaining a search warrant for Coleman's last known address, his grandmother's house in Waukegan, Illinois, just a few miles across the state line from where the Wheats lived. A young woman answered the door. When questioned by the detective, she identified herself as Deborah Brown, Coleman's girlfriend. At first, Brown was reluctant to answer any questions about Coleman or his whereabouts. She said she had been living at the residence for a year, providing home care for Coleman's nearly blind grandmother. The investigators persisted. They finally convinced Deborah to cooperate.
Do you know his whereabouts right now?
She told them that Coleman had been gone all night, but came home alone at about 8 o'clock in the morning. He had come by to change into a suit for a court appearance later that morning.
Can you tell me when the last time you saw him?
Coleman had been charged with raping a 14-year-old girl at knife point. Brown also admitted that Coleman had told her he had done something really bad the night before,
That bad thing?
but he did not explain what.
Recently?
Investigators waited at the house for Coleman's return while other officers canvassed the area.
Okay, do you know if did he drive?
He was nowhere to be found. The FBI joined forces with local investigators. Detectives from Kenosha and nearby Waukegan, Illinois, already knew Coleman's reputation. He was a violent criminal with a disturbing past.
As I learned about Coleman, I realized he was extremely dangerous because the Waukegan Police Department had an extensive arrest record on him. He had been arrested almost 10 years previously for the rape of a 40-year-old woman, and he had a number of other arrests, mostly for assault, for molestation, rape of a child. And as you looked at these cases and you listened to the detectives who were familiar with him, you saw a picture of an increasingly violent person.
The task force enlisted every available officer and agent to help in the search for Coleman and Vernita.
You want to get that?
Well, our strategy that night was to find Alton Coleman. We sat down then at the police department and assembled everything we knew. We came up with information that he a lot of times rode the train, he took taxis because he didn't have a car. What happened then is we split up into teams and went out and started interviewing people.
On the streets, investigators talked with drivers at various taxi stands. Everyone was familiar with Alton Coleman. The cabbies agreed that if they saw him, they would notify the police. The task force offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to Coleman's arrest. The promise of a reward caught people's attention, but didn't draw out any useful leads as quickly as the investigators hoped. Investigators feared that time may be running out for Vernita Wheat. On May 31st, 2 days into the investigation, a cab driver in Waukegan who knew Coleman from the neighborhood called in to report he was picking Coleman up. A squad car conducting surveillance in the area responded. Coleman was dropped off at his sister Terry's place. He saw the approaching officer and took off. disappeared into the neighborhood he knew so well. The investigation was only 2 days old, and their suspect was within their grasp. Investigators speculated Coleman was probably hiding out in the abandoned warehouses that ran along Lake Michigan. Hoping that Coleman might respond to his sister's voice, the detectives summoned her.
Waukegan Police, ma'am, please open up. I'm Detective Hanson from Nurse Antoine.
Though she was Coleman's own flesh and blood, she was also a mother of a young girl. The agents convinced her to help. Talking to her brother through a bullhorn, she pleaded with him to turn himself in.
Elton, you need to come on out and give yourself up.
Meanwhile, officers and agents fanned out and searched the area. But even in such a confined space, finding Coleman would not be easy. Lieutenant Mark Hansen of the Waukegan Police Department was the lead investigator for the task force.
This area has a lot of abandoned buildings, a lot of abandoned apartment complexes. It's heavily brushed. It was at nighttime, easy to escape in there and not be seen again. This was 1984. We didn't have helicopters with searchlights. We didn't have infrared. We didn't have the resources to fully encircle an area of that size.
The search continued through the night. But after 8 hours, it seemed their suspect and their best chance of finding 9-year-old Vernita had slipped through their fingers. Desperate to generate leads, investigators saturated the local media with details surrounding the abduction. TV and newspapers ran photographs of Vernita Wheat, asking anyone with any information to contact the task force. The news spread quickly. Investigators were flooded with sightings of Coleman from the public. Most were dead ends. But one cab driver who saw Vernita's picture on the news contacted the task force. He remembered picking up Coleman and the little girl on the night of her disappearance. He had assumed they were father and daughter. The cab driver dropped them off around midnight near a scrapyard in the industrial section of Waukegan.
That one particular night.
Where did you take him to?
Investigators approached the night manager at the scrapyard.
Sir, I'm Detective Hanson, Waukegan Police. Here's my card. This is Agent Showers.
He told them that he had in fact seen a man with a young girl on the night in question. He recalled that close to midnight, the two had walked hand in hand through the side gate. He couldn't really see the man's face, but he did notice that the man had an unusual rolling gait to his walk, a feature that acquaintances of Coleman had described. The night manager identified the little girl as Vernita Wheat. The sighting was enough to allow the FBI to issue a federal warrant for Alton Coleman. He had taken Vernita across state lines. It was also the last time anyone saw Vernita Wheat alive. The task force responded with another massive search.
We had about 150 FBI agents and detectives from both Kenosha and Waukegan. We did a methodical search where Coleman was last seen with Vernita. This included using dogs going through the junkyard, house-to-house and abandoned building searches, all in this downtown area, and we found nothing.
Investigators knew she was alive at midnight on the evening she disappeared. They also knew that Coleman was alone the next morning at 8 a.m. as he prepared for his court appearance.
So total there's
The question was, what happened to Vernita during that 8-hour gap?
profile from FBI headquarters in Coleman.
FBI Special Agent Jeff Showers was on the task force. he struggled to fit the pieces together.
How far is he going to travel with this girl? The girl may not even be in Waukegan. She may be in another town. But we knew that the longer that we waited, it was getting dimmer and dimmer.
Coleman and Vernita seemed to have vanished. On the night of June 19th, 3 weeks after Vernita's disappearance, investigators received a call from a man in Waukegan who was looking through an abandoned building for scrap metal to sell. On the second floor of the wrecked apartments, he made a horrifying discovery. The body of a child lay on the bathroom floor. Alton Coleman, the FBI's prime suspect in the abduction of 9-year-old Vernita Wheat from her home in Kenosha, Wisconsin, remained at large. As the hunt for Coleman intensified, a man scouring for scrap metal in an abandoned building in Waukegan, Illinois, came across the lifeless body of a young girl. The forensic team arrived at the building. Beneath a blanket, wrapped in a man's corduroy jacket, the investigators found the young girl. Her hands, feet, and neck were bound by a television cable. She was too badly decomposed to confirm her identity. But Special Agent Jeff Showers believed they had found the body of Vernita Wheat.
The clothing matched the description that we had from the mother. She was still wearing the barrettes in her hair that matched from what her mother had described her as being last known to be wearing. She was wearing the green nylon jacket. In the pocket of the jacket were carnival tickets, and we knew from an interview of her mother that the night in question, Alton Coleman had taken Vernita Wheat to a carnival.
While the investigators suspected the body was Vernita Wheat, it was up to the forensic team to prove that the remains were hers. They also needed to find evidence that could conclusively point to the killer. Starting from the location of the body, they worked their way out in concentric circles, collecting anything that looked like it could be used as evidence. Investigators swabbed walls and door frames in an effort to find prints. Figuring whoever moved the body into the room had to come in contact with the door, they removed it from its hinges and sent it to the FBI labs in Washington, D.C. Under the lab's microscopes, FBI examiners discerned a thumbprint on the door. Comparison to samples they had on file were conclusive. The thumbprint came from Alton Coleman. Examiners also compared prints taken from the little girl's hands to those lifted from Vernita Wheat's school books that had been retrieved from her home. That comparison was also positive. The search for Vernita was over. Investigators now had enough evidence to issue another warrant for Alton Coleman. This time, it was for the murder of Vernita Wheat.
We knew then that Alton Coleman was responsible for the death of this child. And now we've got not only a kidnapper, but we also have someone who's committed murder.
While at the autopsy to determine Vernita Wheat's exact cause of death, a television news broadcast caught the attention of Agent Showers and Detective Hansen.
The first news that a little girl had been found murdered in Gary, Indiana. Agent Showers, I think, immediately thought that there could be some connection to Coleman.
The report also mentioned something that investigators found disturbing. There were 2 killers, and the second suspect was described as being a black female. Investigators immediately suspected Coleman's girlfriend, Deborah Brown, who had not been seen in weeks. If investigators were right, Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown had traveled 90 miles from their hometown neighborhood.
Okay, you can
They were on the move, and they were leaving bodies along their way.
Come up with another form of transportation, and then he comes out of it.
At the hospital in Gary, Indiana, local police officers questioned 9-year-old Mary James about the afternoon of June 16th. Mary told the officers that she and 7-year-old Janice Clay were walking to the store when they were approached by a man and a woman on bikes.
Good. Hey, look.
The couple introduced themselves. They told the little girls that they had some clothes that the girls might like.
We got some shoes and stuff. You guys want to take a look at it? Okay, cool. We'll look right around.
To retrieve the clothes, Mary and Janice followed the couple into the woods.
You're 8 years old? How old are you?
You take care of yourself. We're gonna get the man.
Mary was close to death when she managed to drag herself to the street.
I'll show you these photos. I'll show you these photos.
She was able to identify Coleman, but could not identify Brown from photographs sent by the FBI.
No.
However, the girl's description matched Brown exactly.
How about this one right here?
Now, investigators were dealing with 2 killers.
We had looked at Deborah Brown up until that point in time as a witness because she had cooperated with us in Waukegan. She had told us about Alton telling her that he had done something wrong. She showed us the clothes that he had been wearing the night he had come back, when he'd been out all night and when he came back in the morning. So we had looked at her as a witness. We now knew from the investigation in Gary that she was likely assisting him.
Investigators struggled to figure out some way to predict Coleman and Brown's next move. Both murders occurred in largely black communities where the two could easily blend in. And they were quick to gain people's trust.
These were street people. They had that charm. They didn't have to do any arm twisting. It was always a very easy thing with them.
Searching for anything that might help them locate and stop the killers, investigators consulted an FBI behavioral profiler. For the profiler, the escalating pattern of violence was caused by Coleman's legal problems back in Waukegan.
He saw the fact that he had taken Vernita the night before a court appearance on the rape of a 14-year-old, and that he had abducted her and then murdered her as an indication that he was responding to the stress of the court appearance, and so that he would continue to murder out of anger and stress and rage.
Investigators had reason to fear that the 2 murders were only the beginning of a ferocious crime spree. To capture a serial killer, the profiler suggested a massive national media campaign aimed at the black communities.
So we started a publicity campaign, releasing his photograph, releasing pictures of Brown to the media, press releases, everything we could to get his picture out in the forefront. Our hope was that somebody would see him and turn him in.
But the task force was always a step behind. On July 8th, agents received information from local Ohio detectives about an elderly woman named Rose Wiggins who reported her daughter missing. Rose explained that earlier in the day she had come by to check on her daughter and found the door locked. Her young grandson, James, was too frightened to open the door. The detective convinced him they were there to help. Now he had nothing to fear. Officers immediately started to search the house for the boy's missing mother. While looking, they found 3-year-old Johnny, afraid like his older brother. Meanwhile, James told the detective about the man and woman who had been at their house. He showed the 8-year-old photos of the suspects, Coleman and Brown.
This is the lady, right?
James positively identified them as the couple who were there the night before.
You're absolutely sure? Okay, Raymond. How you doing? Detective Smith.
Searching the house for the boy's mother, the police found blood smeared throughout the kitchen. It led down to the basement. Not knowing who or what awaited them, the investigators followed the grisly trail. In Ohio, police responding to a missing persons call made an alarming discovery. The young son of the missing mother had identified fugitives Coleman and Brown as having been in their home. Blood stained the walls. They proceeded cautiously, not knowing if their suspects could still be lurking in the darkened basement. The trail stopped, where the bodies of mother and daughter, Virginia and Kimberly Blake, were discovered, shoved into a crawl space beneath their home.
Coleman and Brown, we didn't know where they were, and the violence connected with the murders and the crime scenes was beginning to intensify.
The officers continued their search, still believing their suspects could be somewhere in the family's home. But they seemed to have slipped away, leaving behind unmistakable evidence, clippings of jerry-curled hair. James recounted for investigators that his mother, Virginia, had met Coleman and Brown earlier in the day.
What you guys doing? Fun. Hey, we just moved to the area down the street. What's your name?
The couple stopped by the house and played with the kids.
Yes, we like live down the street. We're just like riding around.
Virginia invited them to stay for dinner. It was just like any other summer evening in the neighborhood. Virginia cooked while the kids hung around and chatted with their new friends.
Are you going to go ahead and rent? You can stay.
8-year-old James saw Coleman take a knife from the counter and slip it into his back pocket.
Soup's on, guys. Soup's on.
After enjoying dinner together, Coleman, Brown, James, and his younger brother settled into the living room to watch television. At the top of the evening news, the story of a pair of killers on the loose flashed across the screen. Coleman immediately turned off the television and shuffled the boys off to bed,
Have a good night.
while Kimberly and Virginia washed the dishes. Aware of the growing media attention, Coleman realized he and Deborah needed to change their look. He found some scissors and cut off his hair. Coleman, with Brown at his side, approached the little girl and her mother. Just upstairs, James and Johnny were asleep.
What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?
They dragged the slain woman and her daughter downstairs and stuffed them into a crawl space.
The pressure was mounting. It was becoming increasingly stressful because here we were for the 4th time catching up with him when we found more bodies.
Coleman and Brown's MO was designed to catch their victims off guard.
Okay, Raymond, nothing's gonna happen.
When someone comes up to your house on a bicycle you figure them to be local. If they're walking, you may be a little bit suspicious. But if they're riding a bike, they're from the neighborhood. Your guard is automatically down.
News of the murdered mother and daughter horrified the community. The savage nature of the killings caused the FBI to add an 11th position on their 10 most wanted fugitives list. It was a rare occurrence. The number 11 ranking was reserved for particularly vicious killers, a description fitting Coleman and Brown.
The magnitude and the importance of it, that, you know, you've already got 10 that are bad, but here's one that's so bad, but we don't have room to put anybody else on. We're going to make an exception and put him on anyway, even though he's number 11.
With the national media spotlight focusing on the couple, it would be difficult for them to remain anonymous.
And in solving fugitive cases, finding people, there is nothing better than publicity, because all you need is the one phone call from one person saying, I saw this picture and I know it's this individual.
Phone calls poured in with more frequency and speed than ever before. Any crime that matched their suspect's MO was funneled back to the task force headquarters. Hopefully, they would be able to get one step ahead of the fugitives. Investigators were sure that Coleman and Brown would tire of a life on the run and return to familiar territory. Agents contacted everyone the two associated with in Waukegan.
We would contact them and let them know that we're still looking for them. We would go out and tell them that Alton and Deborah had been involved in another murder case, hoping that that would get them a little bit more on our side.
On July 13th, local investigators responded to a frantic 911 call from a suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio. Michelle Stone told the officers what had happened that day.
They were both young.
A couple arrived at the Stones' house earlier that morning. They told Michelle's father, Jack Stone, that they were interested in buying his camper, which was for sale in the driveway. Jack's wife, Anna, joined them on the porch. As Jack and Anna chatted with them, Michelle left for work.
I won't be long. I'll see you guys later. You'll be home for dinner? Yeah, I will. All right.
Be careful, Mom.
Bye-bye.
I remember I didn't really see them.
When she arrived home later that day, Michelle noticed the bikes the couple had arrived on were still in the yard. And her father's car was missing.
Mom?
Inside, she found her parents' home had been vandalized.
Mom?
She had called out to her mother and father. Hearing no response, her mind began to race as she stepped through the shattered glass and overturned furniture littering the room.
Dad? Mom? Dad?
As she called 911, Michelle could hear a weak voice calling out from another room.
Dad?
Next to the basement door, she noticed a bloody palm print.
Dad? Dad, are you here?
She walked down into the dimly lit room, not knowing what or who she might find. Lying next to each other, motionless on the floor, she discovered her parents. Her father, Jack, was barely alive. As she reached to take her mother's pulse, she lifted the sheet. Her mother, Anna, was dead. Michelle waited by her father's side for help to arrive.
sheet over her body.
Her parents had been bludgeoned and bound. Michelle's description of the couple that had stopped by her parents' house earlier that day matched the fugitives, Coleman and Brown. A forensic team went to work collecting evidence. Among the items was a pair of plastic shoes next to Anna Stone. A recent sighting of the suspects included a description of Brown wearing these same shoes. Crime scene technicians also retrieved other bloodied tools found around the body. Later, forensics confirmed the crowbar was used to kill Mrs. Stone. Coleman's prints were all over it. He made no attempt to conceal his crimes. But there was nothing to suggest where the couple had gone.
It was all dead ends. Every time we'd find a body, they were gone. You don't have anything as to which way they're going. You have no indicators as to who their next victim's going to be. Depends. If they wanted sexual gratification, they may snatch a child. If they need a vehicle, they may snatch an adult. Just don't know. We've got a couple of mad dogs out there.
The crime against the Stones showed the couple was able to gain the trust of people from outside the black urban centers where they had found their first 4 victims. This realization only complicated the investigation. Coleman could fit in anywhere.
Or they would come up on a bicycle and start chatting, and he would be looking to play in a card game. Or sometimes they would respond, they wanted to buy something, or they had something for sale. He was an extremely glib person, a real con man. And people trusted him. Plus, he was traveling with a woman. And so people were not nearly as suspect of him as they should have been.
Though Coleman's rage continued to intensify, his ability to charm more victims remained consistent. And he was showing no signs of growing tired of the kill. A month and a half had passed since Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown embarked on a killing spree that had left 5 victims dead. In Cincinnati, Coleman bludgeoned a husband and wife, leaving the wife dead and the husband barely clinging to life. Their car was missing. An APB was immediately put out on the vehicle. Two days later, a farm worker discovered the abandoned car on his property in Lexington, Kentucky, 105 miles away from the crime in Cincinnati. In less than 2 days, the fugitives had traveled hundreds of miles across 2 states. The FBI media blitz was leaving them with few places to hide. But the couple appeared to be heading further away from their home in Illinois, not closer, as investigators had hoped.
When you're talking about Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown, they are not a normal killing machine. A normal killing machine is going to be one person. We've now got 2 out there. They're working together. They're feeding off each other, and one's giving support. Those are the problems. We couldn't separate them. We couldn't talk to one. We couldn't talk to either one of them.
Knowing Coleman would eventually need to steal a car, the FBI saturated the Lexington, Kentucky area. They did not have to wait long for signs that he was still in town. In a hotel parking lot, Professor Oline Carmichael was assaulted and his car stolen. A couple forced him to hand over his cash and car keys. Leaving the professor wounded but still alive, they sped away. After receiving medical attention, Police asked Carmichael to look at mugshots that included the FBI's most wanted fugitives. Without hesitating, he pointed to Coleman and Brown.
That's her, without a doubt. Those are the two.
The FBI were now only a few hours behind the fugitives. An APB was issued for Carmichael's car. In a matter of hours, they received a response. It came from police in an Ohio town close to the Kentucky border. The professor's car was found, abandoned behind some vacant buildings. Coleman and Brown, however, were nowhere in sight. For the experienced agents, finding the car in Ohio meant Coleman and Brown were probably on their way home.
Gut instinct is going to tell you that he's going to come back home. He may not come back to Waukegan, but he's going to come back to some place that he feels comfortable with. He'd never been to Gary, Indiana. He'd never been to Detroit. He had never been to Toledo. Had never been to Cincinnati, Dayton, Ohio, Lexington, Kentucky. At some point, he's going to get tired, and he's going to want to get back to comfort. Some place that he feels comfortable. He knows the streets. He knows the people. He's going to feel comfortable. He's coming back.
The FBI immediately set up a dragnet. Agents and police officers from across several states joined forces to track Coleman and Brown as they headed home to Illinois. Reports of stolen vehicles or assaults were to be given immediate attention. An officer in Dayton, Ohio, responded to a report involving an assault and a stolen car. The call came from an elderly couple, Reverend and Mrs. Gay. Reverend Gay had been badly beaten. Mrs. Gay told the officer that a young couple who they had met weeks earlier broke into their house. After beating them, the attackers demanded the keys to their station wagon. According to the description, the attackers were Coleman and Brown. New leads were coming in at a furious pace. Coleman and Brown were still just out of reach. But the FBI was starting to close the gap. The day after the attack in Ohio, detectives involved in the FBI's dragnet discovered a station wagon that had been abandoned near a car wash in Indiana. It belonged to Reverend Gay. Later in the day, some road crew workers on the edge of Interstate 65 outside of Zionsville, Indiana, made a gruesome discovery. It was the body of an elderly man who had been reported missing from his home in Indiana. He was found on his 77th birthday. Evidence left at the scene was unmistakable. Coleman and Brown had claimed another life. The body was found less than 20 miles from the couple's home turf. The country's most wanted fugitives had come home, and the FBI was waiting for them. For 7 weeks, Coleman and Brown assaulted and killed victims in 6 different states. While investigators worked the crime scenes, scores of local officers and agents organized a dragnet to trap them as they headed back home to Illinois. The aggressive media campaign was having an impact. On July 20th, in Evanston, Illinois, a man spotted Alton Coleman with Deborah Brown in Mason Park. While he waited with the car running, his friend called the police. It was the one phone call investigators had been hoping for.
He went to school with Alton Coleman. He knew without a shadow of a doubt that the man that crossed the street in front of him was Alton Coleman.
Evanston police responded. Only a couple of yards stood between the law and Coleman and Brown. With surprising ease, they were able to corner Coleman. He insisted they had the wrong man. A second pair of officers surrounded Brown. When asked, she gave a different pair of names for herself and Coleman.
What's your name?
Trina Williams.
Having found a knife and a false identification, the officers brought Alton Coleman to the police station.
4 other units be advised when you pick up the female, she might have a weapon in her purse. Make sure you check it. She's 10-0.
A search of Brown's handbag uncovered a .38 caliber pistol.
523-607. Units over here. We got
The weapon was all they needed to handcuff her and take her in.
Anything we need to know about? No.
2 of the FBI's most wanted were apprehended without incident. After nearly 2 months, the violent rampage was over. Coleman continued to insist he hadn't been in any of the places where the murders happened. But the forensic evidence collected over the past 7 weeks proved otherwise. Alton Coleman was charged with the federal crime of kidnapping Vernita Wheat, followed by murder charges in 3 other states. Deborah Brown was also charged for her role in the murders. As investigators from the task force looked on, a strip search uncovered a bloody steak knife. It would be linked to yet another murder, a 15-year-old Ohio girl, Alice Myers. Illinois State's Attorney Matthew Chansey was given the task of prosecuting Alton Coleman. In his mind, the motive was simple.
With Vernita Wheat, he crossed a threshold, and once he crossed that threshold, it was easy for him, and I think that he enjoyed it. And it wasn't just easy anymore; it was something he liked. He liked doing, and so he looked for every opportunity he could to repeat that.
Together, Coleman and Brown had stolen 7 lives. 3 states sought to take theirs. Brown stood trial separately. She was sentenced to life in prison. Until the end, she was committed to Coleman.
At Coleman's sentencing hearing for that murder, she testified on his behalf that she had committed the murder and he had not, in an obvious attempt to try to save him. It didn't work.
Coleman and Brown's rampage had covered over 1,300 miles in 6 states. For Special Agent Berdina Passanelli, the intensity of the FBI's hunt prevented more needless murders.
Because of the massive investigation that we did and the publicity that we did, that he was caught within 7 weeks of when he started. Had we not done that, had we not gotten on this right away, who knows how long he would have gone on killing people.
In the end, Alton Coleman was sentenced to death 4 times. He went to prison in Ohio, where he was executed on April 26, 2002.